Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. Mothers play an important role in our lives, and it is important as a national holiday that we recognize them, and so I want to say Happy Mother's Day. Next week, we're going to be looking at our Godly Women series. We're going to be looking at the Proverbs 31 woman, and for those of you who wish Deborah was on the list, many of you handed in handwritten notes saying you wanted me to add Deborah to the list. I might have told you or might not have told you. I know I only spoke to a couple of you that did that. I had intended to talk about Deborah on Mother's Day. So I encourage you to join us tonight as we talk about the power of God through the Song of Deborah and what God did for his people when a mother took action. But this morning, we're going to talk about manly saints. Taking our text from 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14, as you can see on the slide above me and in the bulletin, 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14 is going to serve as our base text. I was looking for a picture that depicted manliness, and I came across this painting by Berlin Alexander from 2013. It's titled, "David Protects Sheep from a Lion and a Bear." And I thought, what more manly picture is this of David as a youth, not yet even 20. He's not numbered among the soldiers of Israel at this time. And Goliath of Gath, the giant, is defying the armies of Israel in 1 Samuel 17. Saul hears that David is upset about that and wants to do something about it. So David is brought before Saul. And Saul's looking at this young kid and he says, "And what can you do?" And David says, "I tended the flocks of my father. And when a lion and a bear came against them, I tracked them down and I killed them." And he says, "God delivered me from the paws of the lion and of the bear." And he says, "This Philistine, this giant of Gath is going to be like one of them. He's no more different than a lion or a bear coming after the sheep." In this case, the sheep being God's people. And David says, "He will be delivered into my hands." And so this is a picture of a young boy with such faith in God that God used through him not only to deliver his father's sheep, but this young boy, after telling this story to the king of Israel, is going to deliver Israel from a giant, and he's going to become a legend. But he gives all the credit, all the glory and honor to God for it. But I want to make a disclaimer. Throughout this lesson, you're going to see some very manly pictures, including 3 presidents. So look for that. Look for that. But I want to begin. You might have already been turning to 1 Corinthians 16, and I'm happy you did so. We're going to be starting there. But before we jump to 1 Corinthians 16, I want us to look at a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, 13 to 14. And we're going to find out that once a person decides to obey the gospel, once they make that commitment to obey God from the heart and do what he has said, this is a lifetime commitment. This is something we tell God he is going to be first in our lives. He is our first priority. And this is where real duty and real responsibility begin. I'm reading from the King James on this one, Ecclesiastes 12, 13 to 14. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." I do like the way it's worded better in the New King James, so I add that on there. It says this is man's all. That is literally what that Hebrew word means. This is man's all. This is our duty. This is our responsibility. And then he tells us why. "For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." In John 14, verse 15, Jesus said, "If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." There are a lot of people today who say they love Jesus. A lot of people today that say they belong to Jesus. But yet they don't love and keep his commandments. They do what they want to do. They pick and select the commandments that they're going to keep, and they're not even consistent in those. In John 15, verse 14, Jesus said, "You are my friends if you keep my commandments." Jesus says, "You're my friends, and if you love me." He tied obedience to love, and he tied obedience into whether or not we truly are his friends. But in 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14, as Paul is wrapping up his farewell to the brethren at Corinth, as he's tying up this letter, his first letter to them, and what has become known as 1 Corinthians. In chapter 16, verses 13 to 14, he's giving them 5 things that they need in their daily walk with Christ. And he's going to give them these 5 things. This is going to serve as our text for this morning. We're going to look at these 5 things. He says, be on the alert. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. As I read through this, one of the things that stands out to me is he says, act like men. Now, if you go back to the first part of this letter, this is not addressed to the men. This is not addressed to the preacher. It's not addressed to the elders and deacons. If you go back to the first part of this letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 tells us it's addressed to the church of God at Corinth. He addresses both men. He addresses women. We can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and see he's talking to the unmarried. He's talking to the married. He's included everyone in this letter. But he says, act like men. And I found that very interesting, and so I began looking at this and hope to share with you this morning my thoughts on these 5 things that he tells them as he wraps up his letter to them. But one of the first things that we need to recognize is that all men, and by men we mean mankind, women and men, have the duty to obey God. And once they do, true duty to God begins. Our true responsibility begins once we pledge that commitment to Christ. Remember what Solomon in all his wisdom wrote. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. This is the whole duty of man. One of the first things Paul says here on this list is to be alert. 1 Corinthians 16:13, New King James would say, watch. Watch. Be alert. God's people have always been called upon to watch. They've always been called upon to be a watchman on the wall. In fact, in Ezekiel 3, verse 17, God says just that. He says, see, behold, I have made you a watchman. He says, when you see someone in sin, you are to warn them. If you do not warn them, and they die in their sins, they will be judged for that, but their blood will be required of you. Why? Because as a watchman, he didn't warn. What's the job of a watchman? The job of a watchman is to warn of danger, to sound out the alarm. He says, I put you as a watchman over the house of Israel. You, Ezekiel, are in charge of making sure that when they are in sin, you tell them about it. He said, when the righteous man begins turning from his ways, if you don't warn him, he will die in his sins and he will be judged, but his blood will be required of you because you did not sound the alarm. He says, but if that righteous man turns from his sin and stays on that path, then he will live and so will you. Ezekiel was placed as a watchman. And this is in direct contrast if we look over in Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 10. As God is talking through Isaiah, this is before Ezekiel. This is the importance of Ezekiel being a watchman. As God is talking to Isaiah, about 100 or so years, 150 years before the captivity of Judah, God tells Israel through Isaiah, the watchmen are blind and mute dogs. What good is a blind and mute watchman for? Absolutely worthless. You don't put the blind mute guy on the wall and say, all right, tell us when there's danger. 1, they can't see it, and 2, they can't warn about it. Right? God says that's what happened to the people over his people in Israel. The watchers, the leaders, that would be the king, the priest, the scribes, the prophets. He says they're all blind and mute dogs. They're worthless. And because of that, Israel was going to go into captivity. They were going to fall. God's people have been called upon to watch. And lestly we think, well, this is talking about Ezekiel. This is talking about Israel. We need to note that God's people have always been called upon to watch. And in the New Testament, elders are to watch for our souls. Hebrews 13:17. We, as saints, are to watch for those that we might teach. John 4:35, Colossians 4:2-4. We are to watch for and be ready to resist Satan. 1 Peter 5:8-9. James 4:7 tells us we can resist him firm in our faith. But we need to recognize him as a danger. We need to be able to warn others of that same danger. We're to watch for false teachers. Paul told Timothy this in 2 Timothy 4:3-5. He told him that men were going to fall away from inside the faith. They were going to start turning aside to doctrines of demons. They were going to sear their consciences as with a branding iron. 1 John 4:1, Jude 3. We're to test the spirits. We're to contend earnestly for the faith once for all handed down to the saints. We need to watch our own selves. We need to watch our behavior. James 1:19, Philippians 1:27 tells us that we need to be watchful of our conduct and our temper, not given over to outbursts of anger. We need to be watching ourselves for our speech and our deeds, the very words that we say, the actions that we take. We are accountable for all of it. We need to be watchful and mindful of those things. And 1 Thessalonians 5:6, Mark 13:35-37, 2 Peter 3:10-12, we need to be on the watch and be alert and be ready for Christ's second coming. In fact, 1 Thessalonians 5:6 says, you are not people that this should overtake you. It is going to come. It's going to happen like a thief in the night, but not to you. It should not overtake you. It should not surprise you. Why? Because you're not of darkness, you're of light. He calls upon them to be daylight disciples, to be watchful, to be alert, to be ready. He says, you're to be watching and to be ready for it so that it does not overtake you. Our lives are to be spent on the alert, that we might watch for our souls, that we might look out for the souls of others and hasten the day of the Lord. Peter says we need to be the type of people in holiness and godliness that we look for it and hasten it, not try to hide from it, not tell God, I just need a little more time. We need to be ready when He comes. The next thing Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians 16:13 is he says, stand firm in the faith. Stand firm in the faith. Be on the alert. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. Saints must learn to take a stand for the truth of the gospel. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul gives us the pieces of the armor of God. In Roman times, the whole armor of a legionnaire was called the panoply. So what Paul is telling them is to take on the panoply of God. Take on that full armor. And he gives them the pieces starting in verses 10 through 14. He's telling them that when the smoke clears, they need to be standing firm. He tells us the reason he gives us the pieces of the armor. He says that you can stand firm. And if you write in your Bibles, and if you're there in Ephesians 6, 10 through 14, right in the margins there of 1 John 5:4, if it's not already there, because our victory comes through our faith. He says our faith is what overcomes the world. Faith is the victory. We sing that song. We ought to belt that out when we sing it. Faith is the victory. Faith is what will overcome the world. I would also encourage you at that margin of your Bible in Ephesians chapter 6, talking about standing firm, to write in there 1 Peter chapter 5, 8-9, knowing who our enemy is, the devil. He roams about like a roaring lion. Becky's laughing because I always get tongue-tied there and I say the wrong thing. But I said it right this time. Prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But notice verse 9. But resist him firm in your faith. We do that through the pieces of the armor. That shield of faith ought to be before us. It says with it, we can quench the fiery darts of Satan. You know, the Romans would often coat their shields in a substance that would extinguish flaming arrows. Because it was a famous tactic. Everyone did it. You would coat your arrows in fire and launch them, and they would do an amazing amount of damage. They wouldn't just pierce through, but they would burn a person's clothes. They would set them on fire, and it's very difficult to fight and be watchful of the battlefield when you are on fire. So your first concern is that not only that arrow sticking in you or in your armor somewhere, but you got to douse the flames, right? The Romans were great at coating their shields with a substance that when those fiery darts hit them, they were extinguished out. Paul's using that imagery, saying our shield of faith is that way. That will extinguish those flaming darts of Satan. We won't get burned. But when we drop or we lower that shield, we set ourselves up to be vulnerable. So I would also write in the margin there, in Ephesians chapter 6, on the shield of faith, James chapter 4, and verse 7, where he says, resist him firm in your faith. Both Peter and James tell us we can resist Satan. We only fall to temptation when we want to and we give in to it. Saints must learn to take a stand for the truth of the gospel. The armor of God is to give saints the strength to stand. And the 1 John 5:4 tells us faith is that victory. We must recognize the source of our strength is only found in Jesus. Without him, we can't do it. We can't do it alone. We need him. If we go back to John chapter 15, we find out that he is the vine, we are the branches. He says, apart from me, Remember what he says? You can do nothing. The branch apart from that vine, what happens when you cut a branch off a vine? Does it grow and prosper? No, it dies. It withers away. It's going to become dry and good for nothing but to throw in the fire. That's what Jesus says happens to the Christian that tries to be a Christian apart from Him. It can't happen. Your faith, your life will wither up and be good for nothing. Jesus says you can't do it without me. Paul says that in Philippians chapter 4, 1 and verse 13. Recognizing that his source of strength is in Jesus. Christians must stand up for the truth. Jude 3 says, contend earnestly for the faith. I've always found it interesting, that word contend in the Greek. This word that English translators translate as contend really means down and dirty fighting. It means hand-to-hand combat. In fact, this word was very commonly used in association with the wrestling games of the Olympics. If you imagine the wrestling games of the Olympics, it's very hands-on. They don't stand back and just hurl barbs and insults at each other. They get their hands on one another and try to pin the other one to the floor. And it was very different in the ancient Olympic days than it is today. It was hand-to-hand combat. And this is the Greek word that Jude chose to use, writing through the Spirit, that we are to contend earnestly for the faith, knowing so many other passages point out, including Ephesians 6, that our battle is not flesh and blood, it's a spiritual battle, but he's telling us it's going to be very personal. You're going to get your hands dirty, right? You have to be in the thick of it to contend earnestly for the faith once for all handed down for the saints. The shield of faith, Ephesians 6 and verse 16. I think I said 6:17 earlier. The shield of faith is mentioned in verse 16, Ephesians 6:16. The shield of faith will only work if we stand firm and use it. That means to fight with it. It does us no good to wear it as an ornament on our backs, to drag it in the sand behind us, saying it's so heavy. Yeah, sometimes having that faith will get heavy. But the Roman soldiers were trained and they practiced with it until that shield, just as the sword, became an extension of their arms. By putting into practice our faith day to day, we'll get stronger, we'll become more faithful, and we will see those little victories. And it starts with the little victories, extinguishing those fiery darts of Satan. In 1 Corinthians 16:13, not only does he say be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, but he does say act like men. And again, he's talking not to just a group of men, but to a group of saints, women and men together, children. And he says, act like men. If you're reading from the New King James, it says, be brave. Be brave. But act like men is the Greek word, andrizomai, Strong's 407, and it means to act manly. So to act like men means something a little beyond just being brave. That andrizomai means to act manly. Be a man. Sometimes the versions will say, acquit yourselves like men. Acquit like men. I found this image as I was looking for manly pictures. It says, sawdust? You mean man glitter? I wanted to blow that up and put it on a man cave, but I don't quite have one of those yet. But if you have a man cave, this should probably go on that wall. And then I found a picture of a man just fist fighting a bear, and I was reminded of David and wondered how that looked. David tells Saul that he would grab the lion or the bear by their mane or their beard and strike them dead. And it looks like that's what this guy's pretty much doing. So I thought that's pretty manly. But Paul says, act like men. In contrast to being weak or immature, he's saying be brave, be manly. You know, in the last few decades, men have been portrayed as something less than manly. And it's become even a derogatory statement to tell someone that they're manly. In contrast to the weak-natured portrayal of men today, all saints, men and women, must be brave and act like men, or I summarize that or paraphrase saying, be manly. In the last few decades, men have been made to feel somewhat ashamed for being manly. I don't know where that actually began. It seems like if you look at some TV shows and movies in the late 80s, that started to become a trend, but it seems like if you watch sitcoms and movies from the 80s, men were depicted as manly men. But as you get into the 90s, there's a definite shift, not only in the movies, but the portrayal of men on TV. That was, if you couldn't afford to go to the movies, maybe you turned on the TV, and that's what you were subjected to. There was a phrase from the 1990s. It perhaps began earlier, but as I began researching this phrase, it seems like it originated somewhere in the 90s. A lot of different people have called credit for it, but there was a phrase that said, get in touch with your feminine side. You guys all remember hearing that? You heard that? I don't remember hearing that in the 80s. I remember hearing that in the early 90s. And as I was researching this, some researchers suggest that maybe in some other form it was suggested before, but most researchers agree this was a 90s term. And what they were trying to say with this phrase is that it's okay for men to show their emotions. And while I agree with that, we should not feel that we can't display emotions. Our wives definitely want us to be able to display emotions. What happened with this phrase is people ran with it and began depicting men as soft, depicting them as if they were manly. They depicted them as Neanderthals, and we'll talk about that a little later on. They became the brute of the TV show, while the women started becoming more and more the heroes, and the softer men became more and more the heroes of the show. Popular culture was depicting men as more feminine, with some even enjoying typically female pastimes. Men were depicted as enjoying shopping and fashion and etc. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, in fact, Becky will tell you, I love going shopping with her. I miss out when I'm not with her and the kids. And that's something we do together on Mondays, is we go shopping. And while she does the groceries, I take the kids, and that frees her up to get the groceries done fast. And that has worked for us in our marriage. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But the depiction in the culture was depicting that as becoming more and more feminine. In fact, there was a new phrase coined in 1994, and this one we know the source of this phrase. How many of you remember the phrase metrosexual? This came about in 1994. It was coined by, I just had his name, Mark Simpson. A man by the name of Mark Simpson coined this phrase in 1994, and I want to tell you, it wasn't long before it got its way into Webster's. And so Webster's defines it for us. Webster says, a usually urban heterosexual male given to enhancing his personal appearance by fastidious grooming, beauty treatments, and fashionable clothes. And while there is nothing inherently sinful or wrong with enjoying any of these things, the portrayal of men began going downhill from these phrases. There's nothing inherently sinful in men's shopping or even being in the fashion. But it became mainstream from a portrayal of men being soft and getting in touch with their feminine side. Manly men can still be well-groomed and well-dressed, right? We have a lot of sharp-dressed men here tonight that I would not define as feminine. But I would also say that they are great at displaying emotions, right? It does not make them any less of a man. The Cambridge English Dictionary said men usually spend lots of money on fashion and beauty treatments. In fact, Mark Simpson, who coined this term, metrosexual, he described it as masculinity moisturized. That's how he defined this term that he came up with, masculinity moisturized. Now this phrase, I said this was coined in 1994, you might remember this becoming back into the mainstream or gaining new traction or popularity in 2004, or actually 2003, leading up to the 2004 presidential campaign. Howard Dean went on a radio show or a program in Colorado and said, I am a metrosexual. And that caused headlines for an entire week. That was the story. And it brought this phrase from the 90s into the 2000s and gained it traction all over again. During this time period, masculine men were constantly depicted in popular culture as Neanderthals or dim-witted brutes or men from a bygone era or age that needed to become enlightened or trained or taught a better way by the other members of the show. So many examples of that. Now, I am happy to report there has been a slight shift from that recently. I would encourage you to Google. I didn't Google it. There are so many out there, especially in the last decade or so. So many studies done showing that women are sometimes found themselves asking, where did the manly men go? And many women began seeking out manly men. And culture was surprised by this. It was making headlines. You could do a quick Google search and find all kinds of studies saying that women finally said, we don't want the soft linguini spine men that the 90s produced. Right? And all we had to do is look around and say, we know that. Don't Google it now. But a quick Google search tells you there's been a slight shift from that. The last decade has seen a shift from that in TV programming. In movies, it started becoming better and different. But again, the 1990s spawned an entirely different marketing of a whole new array of hygiene products aimed at men. And I'm talking about other than deodorants and colognes, which have always been around. I left out, I need to say it, even hair products. I was introduced to a hair product recently that has been going back as far as 1933, and I know there are hair products even before that. Again, there's nothing wrong with men wanting to do their hair, to be moisturized. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently sinful with that. There's nothing wrong with caring about our appearance, especially for married men when we want to care about our appearance to our wives, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But all of this came about from an incorrect and sinful portrayal of men in our culture. That's what this came about from. These products, it came from a portrayal of men in media that gave an alternate view of man as something other than manly. It became a negative thing to be considered masculine. The products themselves are not sinful, but it came to cater to a differing view on manly men. That's what they started from. And so this call is important to us in 1 Corinthians 16:13. That tells us to act like men. It's important that we go back and we look at how God defined men. This call to action to act like men is not as our society typically depicts men, but as God created man in His image. Genesis 1:26-27 tells us men and women both are created in the image of God. We're to be brave, to take a stand, and to be ready for action. 1 Peter 1 and verse 13. I want you to turn there with me. And we're going to remember this passage. We're going to look at this as we close out tonight's lesson, as we look at the Song of Deborah. Great things happen when a mother took action. And notice what 1 Peter tells us in 1 Peter 1 and verse 13. In verse 13 he says, therefore prepare your minds for action. Again, is he talking just to men? No. Men and women both. He's talking to Christians. Prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Looking for manly pictures, I came across this, and I wish I would have done this slide a little differently and made it a little bigger. But this is Abraham Lincoln riding on a grizzly bear that's roaring into the night, saddled on the American flag, holding a machine gun, and proudly displaying his Emancipation Proclamation. And I thought that looks pretty manly, so I'm going to take that. But we are called to act like men. Ephesians 4:14 says we're no longer to be children. He says, carried by every wind of doctrine. It doesn't matter if people say this is new, this is exciting, because mankind's always been blown away by the new and the exciting. When it comes to religion, we're to look at it for what it is. It's winds of doctrine. Let it pass you by. Stand firm through the storm. We're not to be carried about, tossed about here and there by these winds of doctrine. Titus 2:12 says we're to live as lights, sensibly, righteously, and godly in the present age, children above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Philippians 1:27, Philippians 2:15. Paul commended the Philippians for being lights. You know, it takes courage and it takes strength to stand out from culture. It takes courage and strength to stand out from society and be against what they say is the norm. And look how society shifts. In the last decade or so, these 90s phrases have kind of gone by, and they've come back around to displaying men as we know them to be. They ought to be masculine. They ought to be men. And it takes strength and courage to stand out and be different from the world. If we don't have strength, if we don't have that courage, when those winds of doctrine start coming, and people get all excited about a new doctrine, or some prophet or prophetess somewhere has a new word or revelation from God, and we get all excited about that and we're swayed. You see how you go, if you go back in time, you're going to go back and forth, back and forth. How many different new messages have there been, and they contradict one another? And yet nobody sees the red flag in abiding by any of those. We need to stay strong and stay constant. In Ephesians 6:10-13, telling us to take on the full armor of God so that in the day of temptation we can stand firm. What I like to say is when the smoke clears, you're standing firm. When that heat of battle has died down, the temptation is gone, or that spiritual battle, whatever it might take form as, that you're still standing. It doesn't mean that you don't have holes in your armor. It doesn't mean that you have smoke and tendrils of flame from all the heat and attacks that you took. But God says stand and stand firm and defeat it. We're not to run from it. We're to face it and take it on. The life of a saint requires bravery and courage to weather life's storms and temptations. In looking for manly images online, I came across this one of President Reagan on a raptor. And this raptor's holding the American flag. Reagan is sitting on a saddle of the American flag. His fedora blowing off into the wind, and all the action he's letting loose with a machine gun, and he's got a rocket launcher on his back. And I said, that's manly. I'm going to take that. But 1 Corinthians 16, going back to our text, verse 13, after telling us to be on the alert, telling us to stand firm in the faith, to act like men, that is, be brave, he says, be strong. Be strong. You know, God has always expected his people to be strong, to stand up for him against all odds. It doesn't matter if we're looking in the Old Testament or the New Testament. In Joshua chapter 1, 6-9, Joshua is undertaking a great mission from God. Moses has died. Joshua has taken control of God's people. And God tells him in verses 6-9, he says, only be strong and courageous, and I will be with you. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. Only be strong, be courageous, be brave. Joshua had a lot of difficult tasks ahead. It was falling to Joshua to take out fortified cities in the Promised Land. He was going to need that bravery. He was going to need to be strong because he was going to need to face a people that seemed to go back and forth in their morale. And God's telling Joshua it begins with its leader. It begins with you. Be strong and be courageous. 1 Chronicles 28, 9 and verse 20. David on his deathbed charged Solomon, the next king, his son, to be strong and courageous. David knew what it meant to be strong and courageous. We can go to 1 Samuel 17, 34-37, where he tells King Saul he fought off a lion and he fought off a bear, and he'd do it again and again and again as long as he's called to do it. And he says this giant is going to be like one of them. He saw that giant that defied the armies of Israel for 40 days as nothing more than a bear and a lion. And he says, God delivered them, God's going to deliver him into my hand. He was manly at a young age. And here he is telling his young son that peace has been won. Solomon's not going to have to be the warrior that David was. And yet David's telling Solomon, be strong and courageous. You know, as we move into the New Testament, elders, deacons, preachers, and all members, we looked at they are all responsible for being watchful and alert. All of them, elders, deacons, preachers, and all members, are called upon to be strong. We're all called upon to put on that armor of God, Ephesians 6 and verse 10, to stand firm in the faith. Christianity is further strong. Hebrews 10, 35-39. Here the Hebrew writer is telling his audience they were suffering greatly for their faith. He says, now is not the time to throw away your confidence, which has great reward. He says, God does not delight in the one that shrinks back. He has no pleasure in that person, but for the one whose faith is so strong, it's the preservation of their soul. He says that is where God's pleasure is at. 1 Corinthians 16:13 says, act like men. Be brave. Paul told Timothy to be strong in Christ. 2 Timothy 2, 1-3. To teach others. He says, endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. That takes strength. That takes endurance. That takes courage. Because it can be so discouraging sometimes. As we see life all around us, our own culture, our own society, turning morality on its head, calling evil good and good evil. But when we look back in the pages of the Old Testament, we find it was happening in the days of Isaiah. It was happening at times before the times of Isaiah. And so there's nothing new under the sun. What we think that we are suffering, mankind has suffered before. God's people have done it before. And we're called upon to do it now. to be strong. It takes being strong and courageous to walk the path of righteousness and fulfill our duty to God. Hebrews chapter 12, 12 to 13. Saints are called upon to be strong and courageous, to faithfully serve the Lord. As I looked for manly images, I came across this one of President Washington, holding an eagle like a falconer would a falcon, with a heavy machine gun in one hand and the American flag blowing behind him, and he's standing victoriously over all a pile of his enemies. And I thought, that's manly. That's manly. I got to take that. Saints are called upon to be strong and courageous and to serve God faithfully. But then he says in verse 14, as we get out of verse 13, it tells us all those things, to be watchful, to stand firm, to act like men, and to be strong. He says in verse 14, let all that you do be done in love. Do all things in love. That's how I would summarize that. Love should be our motive in all that we do. 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3, Paul says, if he did all these wonderful things, but love wasn't the motive, he says they're like clanging cymbals and the sound of brass. He says it's just noise. We can do all kinds of great and wonderful things for God, but if it's not out of love, then it's noise. We can do all kinds of wonderful things for our kids and for our spouse, but if it's not done out of love, but for some other motive, it'll come across as just noise. No harmony and no point to it. Futility. All our motivation and all that we do ought to be made from love. In fact, we're told our love to God is seen in our obedience, as I referenced earlier. John 14:15, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. 1 John 5:3 says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. 1 John 5:3 reminds us, going back to John 14:15, that love and obedience are tied together. We must have the right love. Pleasures of life will often keep saints from loving God the way that they should. 2 Timothy 3, 1-5. 1 John 2:15-17 tells us not to love the things of the world, not to be lovers of self. We can have the wrong love. We need to make sure that our love is the right love. And saints know that love is hard. Jesus said in Matthew 5:44-46, we must even love our enemies. That's a difficult thing. Because the natural thing to do is to want to hate them and see harm done to them. But Jesus said saints are to be different. We're to love our enemies. He said even the vilest, even the wicked, even the Gentiles, even the tax collectors know how to love one another. They know how to love their families and their brothers. He says you're not doing anything great when you do that. But as a disciple of Christ, when you love your enemy, Jesus said that's special. That's different. That goes against the natural order of things. That goes against our natural impulses. But our actions will demonstrate our love in all that we do. 1 John 3:18. We must love one another and bear each other's burdens. Ephesians 4, 1-2, 1 Peter 4, 8. We can even see that in Galatians 6, 1-2. And even when we preach, even when we teach, whether it's in public or whether it's one-on-one, we must speak the truth in love. How many times have you been in a Bible class or a Bible study and things get heated? And words are said that then both parties are apologizing for and feelings are hurt? Because it's easy to do. It's easy to get in that trap. We let our emotions get the better of us. We let our attentions run high. Paul's reminding us we need to speak the truth in love. We need to remember why we're in that Bible class, why we're having that Bible study with that individual. Because we love them and we want them to obey the truth. 2 Timothy 2, 24-26 says we're to be able to teach so we can help them escape the snare of the devil. Jude tells us that we snatch them from the fire. That's the reason that we correct. Because we love them. And we want their souls to be saved. We must have love for the truth. 2 Thessalonians 2:10. This is a problem with many people. In fact, 2 Thessalonians 2:10 tells us there are people that did not heed or did not obey the truth because they had no love of it. James 1:21 tells us we are to, in humility, receive the word that can save our souls. We need to have a love for the truth. Love is to be our motive for serving God and loving and serving our fellow man. As we conclude, I hope that as we look at 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14, and we might get what the Corinthian brethren would have got a sense of. Paul is saying, stand firm, be strong, be brave. It's tough, but let everything you do be done in love. So may we strive to live our lives as saints ought to live. Ephesians 5, 3 through 4 says there is a proper way for saints to behave. He says we're to walk in a manner worthy of the calling of Jesus Christ. We're to walk in a manner worthy of saints. Practicing these things in our lives will help us grow. We'll grow spiritually. And will be the kind of Christian, an example to others that God wants us to be. Matthew 5:16, Philippians 2:15, we are called upon to be lights into the dark world around us. And if love is not our motivator, that light's not going to be as bright. We might still speak the truth, and mankind is going to be held accountable to the truth. But Paul says, for us, for the speaker, we need to let all that we say and do be in love. My encouragement this morning is to be manly saints. Be alert, stand firm, be strong and courageous, and do all things from love. And this morning, if you're not a Christian, you need to be. It begins at the point of obedience to God's word. It begins at the point of obedience where you take him, you put him on in baptism. You repent of your sins and you're baptized. You must first obey God, and then, as you practice these things in your lives, then you can be an example to others. And if you are a Christian not living the way that you should, now's the time for correction, to repent and be renewed. And if we can assist you in any way, please let it be known together while we stand and while we sing.